All right, I am now at this last section of this first lecture about Haldeman. Jeez. Oh, this lecturing is hard work. And one of the examples of an oxymoron is typically military intelligence. People talk about because the military has its own intelligence services. The Navy has its. The military has its. In this case, when we talk about the military here, we're probably talking about the Army, but military could be Navy, could be Air Force. The Navy has the National Security Administration and any number of naval intelligence agencies. There are, I don't know, there are at least a dozen intelligence agencies at least a dozen that we know of. Apart from the sort of the one internal ones, the external ones, the CIA is external, FBI is internal, NSA is everything, Homeland Security, and so on. So this concept of military intelligence is, they used to talk about military intelligence and everybody laughed because how can you have these two things together? And this is the kind of thing which Joseph Heller in Catch-22 will really get beautifully. And when people sometimes ask, okay, I read Slaughterhouse-Five and I really liked it, because for some people it just drives them nuts, and I get that. There's going to be a time and a place for it, and for some people it's never. But I do recommend reading Catch-22, not seeing. You can see the movie, but not the George Clooney series. It's okay, but he just screwed it up. I mean, he just did such a crap job of adapting it, and he just took all of the sort of, he left all the blackness in and took all the humor out, and then he changed the ending, which was completely stupid. I mean, that's not the point. He just made his own text out of it. It's like, thanks, George. So it was very annoying. It's like, way to go. Yeah, it's like make the Lord of the Rings and then having Gollum come out with a ring, and Frodo get knocked into the fires in Mount Doom. It's like, no. But the concept is that Army logic is essentially control. It's a world of control. And Mary Gay is aware of this. And she says, life is, and she pauses, and Mandela says, life is a bunch of cells walking around with a common purpose. If that common purpose is to get my ass, oh, William, you sound like old Cortez. Well, Cortez kept us alive. Not many of us, she snapped on 137. And one of the things that comes through here is that Haldeman respects the Army in the brutal way of its training, basically, that when it comes to major systems and the operation of major systems, this system has been honed to a sort of kind of perfection over the course of decades, for really centuries, to do this one job. I mean, now people know about training and they know about what works in boot camps more than they ever have. They know the psychology of how you make a group behave, way more than Full Metal Jacket level. Although a lot of that stuff still applies. And, when I first asked him about his own training, he said, it kept us alive, no doubt about it. We trained in the States. Of course, they trained in Iowa, which was completely stupid. They trained in the middle of the Iowan winters, which are unspeakably brutal. And then they went to the tropics. So, but then they also trained in Vietnam, and this is the training which, then it's a matter of luck as to whether you stay alive, which is why the beginning of platoon is so important. Whenever one of the, so, but at the same time, so there's this sort of respect for the system because you can see the system has learned to do what it does well. At the same time, it also disposes of people. It just uses people up. And the system is not there to care about you or the individual, or the system is there to act as a machine and to turn out military units, not you as a military unit, but a group of people as a unit that stop acting as a group of people, stop acting as individuals and begin to act as a unit. And so the general who is calling off his particular piece of the war on page 117 says, he sat down at the head of our table and looked down the long axis of it, seeing nobody. My own memories of combat are over half a century old. To me, it was exhilarating, strengthening. I must be a different kind of person than all of you. And Mandela's like, or have a very selective memory, I thought. It's like, yeah, exactly. So exhilaration and strength come from the idea of a certain kind of personal combat where you are a hero on the battlefield and you take agency. And this is the kind of myth which O'Brien talks about as being a very old and terrible lie. And it's the kind of thing which you see perpetuated in Danger Close and not that to give everything they had, but the Once Were Soldiers. We Were Soldiers. With Mel Gibson. It was a terrible movie. And where, I mean, there actually is a little girl, you know, who's a little sort of pink unitard in the bed and actually says, you know, Daddy, why do people go to war? And he's like, well, dear, you know, I was like, oh, Jesus. So the idea of necessary losses transmutes to the process of it comes down to total warfare. Now, the concept of total war is something which we looked at in Slaughterhouse-Five, and the idea is that World War II almost looked like total war. I mean, people was like, well, that was total war. It's like, no, not quite, because it would have fully caught up North America as well if it were real total war, but it didn't. The Britain, the Allies were able to maintain, not France, but the non-European allies were able to maintain, because of the geographical situation, basically, a homeland, you know, where there was no, war was going on, but it was a certain, you know, was supply, a war of supply and demand. But at this point, everything comes to be about war, right? So we have to reduce the base to where it can no longer function and take one prisoner. Potter, here, you mean at least one prisoner. I mean what I say. One only. Potter, you're relieved of your platoon on 67. So Potter, who understands total war is about to be practiced, there's going to be a slaughter except for one individual. And at this sign of essentially moral weakness, you know, that she's actually got a sense of moral still, she's immediately relieved of her command, because that's not how this is going to go down. And part of the way that military intelligence functions is to ignore the connections between people, and to try to forge new connections. It's an enormously complex business. So you can't let connections which are organic survive because they can threaten the system. But you want to make war connections between people. So on 177, finally, what we know that this was going to happen. Mary Gay and William are separated. And we sat there for some time, only conscious of each other, and the two sheets of paper that separated us with a gulf as wide and real as death. As I say on 177. Now, for an example of this, have a look at what was happening in World War I. And now here is a picture of a reconstituted quick firer, as they were called. These are postcards which were given to the men before a raid. So this is in World War I, and so before you went on a big mission, that is, you're going to go over the top, and you probably weren't going to come back, you filled out one of these cards. So you were given one of these cards, and they were sent home free. So you just filled one out. Now, you weren't actually allowed to write anything on the card. You had to strike out or tick off the various different boxes. So listen to Paul Fussell talk about this. So it's called a quick firer because that's just so World War One. It's like they begin to use the language of the war to talk about everything. So when people say, "Oh, it was so over the top," it's like, where do you think that comes from? It's like going over the top was a trench war phrase. So when people say, "Oh, it was just over the top," it's like, do you mean you went into trench war? If not, don't use the phrase. Where did wristwatches come from? World War One. right? Because they'd been using pocket watches up until then. So they had to look down at the pocket watch, hold the weapon, hold the whistle in their mouths. This is their officers. Decide, it's now 9 o'clock exactly. This is when they begin. They blow the whistle, go over the top of the trench. Well, it's all too much work. You don't have a hand to spare. So instead, you have a watch on your hand, on your wrist, which you can look at while you're holding the whistle, and you can see it's 9 o'clock. Let's go. Okay, so it's just standard war stuff, which just gets worked into the, just is naturalized and comes into civilian life without people really thinking about it. In the same way that people say, man, that film was a blockbuster. A blockbuster was the name for a bomb dropped in World War II. And they were the kinds of bombs that were dropped on the cities. Not the same kind of thing as dropped on Dresden. But they were called blockbusters because they busted blocks. They were so big that they could blow up a block. So a blockbuster is that. So when we talk about films, we're talking about war. So anyway. So listen... So listen to Fussell talk about these quick fire cards. So have a look at this thing while I'm talking about it. He says, the implicit optimism of the postcard is worth noting. The way it offers no provision for transmitting news like, I have lost my left leg, or I have been admitted to hospital wounded and do not expect to recover. Because it provided no way of saying, I am going up the line again, that is, I'm going back into battle, back into danger, its users had to improvise. Wilfred Owen, Owen was a famous poet, and he was killed 11 days, I think it's 11 days before the World War I ended. And it was something, I think it was 11 days. Like late in October, he was killed. And he was considered to be the genius poet of the war. Sassoon was one, Owen was the other. There were many war poets. I mean, World War I produced a huge number of famous war poets. But Owen and Sassoon are probably the two most known at this point. So Owen had an understanding with his mother that when he used a double line to cross out, I am being sent down to base, it meant he was at the front again. So when he crossed that out, it's like, oh, it means the other thing. Close to brilliant is the way the postcard allows one to admit to no state of health other than being quite well, on the one hand, and on the other hand, being so sick that one is in hospital. The egregious quite seems to have struck users of the card as so embarrassing, they conveniently forgot it as the years passed. Recalling the war 15 years after, Llewellyn Wynne Griffith remembers the words, I am well. And so does Stuart Collette. P.W. Turner and R.H. Haig remember them as I am well and unwounded. And so Fussell did a bunch of work on those, right? One paid for the convenience of using the postcard by adopting its cheerful view of things, by pretending to be in a world where belated mail and a rapidly healing wound are the worst that can happen, and where there is only one thinkable direction to go in, to the rear. Yeah, so... Oh man! So woe betide you, of course, if you use this, and if you don't, you may not get a last note out to your loved ones. So what are you going to do? And this is the catch, essentially, that many of the soldiers find themselves in. And so here is the famous catch-22, as explained by Osarian, and is explained to him by Dr. Nika, who is the only person who can ground the medical doctor who was because medical doctors were drafted too in World War II and in Vietnam and in Korea and sent to the front. I mean, they needed medical doctors, so the military was like, off you go. You're already trained and you're a captain now. Well, away you go. So the medical doctor is the only person who can ground an airman. Because they can say unfit for duty, take away the wings, basically, suspend the wings. So this is what Osarian wants. He wants to be declared unfit for duty. So he goes to Dr. Nika and says, please declare me unfit for duty. And Dr. Nika says, I can do that, but then I have to commit you to duty. And Osarian wants to know why. So here's that explanation.
Outfit, I would have been rotated after 25. Doc, you gotta help me out.
Look, I'm due for rotation myself in a couple of months if I don't cause any trouble or break any rules. And one of the rules says I can't ground anyone just because he asks me to.
Can you ground somebody who's crazy?
Of course, I have to. There's a rule that says I have to ground anyone who's crazy.
I'm crazy!
Who says so?
Ask anybody. Ask Nate, Doc, McWatt. Hey, Orr, tell him.
Tell him what?
Am I crazy?
He's crazy, Doc. He won't fly with me. I take good care of him, but he won't. He's crazy, all right.
That's proof, isn't it? They're all damn crazy.
They're crazy.
Then why do you ground them?
Why don't they ask me to ground them?
Because they're crazy, that's why.
Well, of course they're crazy. I just told you that. You can't let crazy people decide whether you're crazy or not, can you?
He's all crazy.
Of course he is. He has to be crazy to keep flying after all the close calls he's had.
Then why can't you ground him?
I can, but first he has to ask me.
That's all he's got to do to be grounded?
That's all.
And then you can ground him.
No, then I cannot ground him. There's a catch.
A catch?
Sure, catch 22. Anyone who wants to get out of combat isn't really crazy, so I can't ground him.
Okay, let me see if I got this straight. In order to be grounded, I've got to be crazy. And I must be crazy to keep flying. But if I ask to be grounded, that means I'm not crazy anymore and I have to keep flying.
You've got it. That's catch 22. There's some catch on catch 22. It's the best there is.